The bell rang the same way every morning. You sat where they told you, opened what they handed you, and did what the room was set up to teach. 15 subjects, moving through schools from Detroit to Birmingham to Compton, as familiar as the hallways themselves. You never thought any of it was worth remembering. You were wrong. Section 1. Penmanship. Your arm was supposed to do the work, not your fingers, not your wrist, not the tight little grip of a child holding a pencil for the first time. The whole forearm rested flat on the desk and moved, smooth and even, across the paper, while your hand simply held the pencil and followed along. That was the method. A handwriting instructor named Austin Norman Palmer had worked it out in Cedar Rapids, Iowa in the 1880s and published his system in a 46-page pamphlet called Palmer's Guide to Business Writing in 1894. And by the time you sat down in a second-grade classroom with a wide-ruled practice sheet in front of you, his method had already moved through tens of millions of American children. The same arm position, the same drills, the same corrections, in schools from the Mississippi Delta to the south side of Chicago to East Oakland. Penmanship was its own subject. Not 10 minutes folded into English class, not an activity squeezed between reading groups. A dedicated period with dedicated paper, and a teacher whose only job in that hour was to make sure the letters came out right. The practice sheets had 3 lines, not 2, a baseline, a midline, and a top line, and the letters had precise rules about which line they touched. The tall letters, the H, the L, the D, reached the top. The short letters, the A, the O, the N, stayed between the baseline and the midline. The letters with descenders, the G, the Y, the P, dropped a specific distance below the baseline and came back up with a specific curve. The teacher walked the rows the whole period. She would stop behind you, reach down without asking, and adjust the angle of your paper, or reposition your elbow. She would sometimes take your writing hand in hers and move the whole arm the way it was supposed to move, slow and rolling from the shoulder, to give your muscles the sensation of correct before you tried to reproduce it on your own. Then she would let go and watch. Austin Palmer had built his method as a direct answer to what came before it. Spencerian penmanship, the standard in American schools since the 1840s, was ornate. It had shaded strokes, decorative loops, and flourishes that required real time and attention to produce cleanly. Palmer looked at Spencerian and understood that the country had moved on. American business was growing fast. Offices were larger. Clerks were expected to write quickly and legibly for hours at a stretch, and Spencerian was too slow for that kind of demand. So he stripped the ornamentation out. He made the letters lean slightly right. He gave the system 4 stated qualities he described as speed, legibility, ease, and durability, and he built the entire method around the large muscles of the forearm and shoulder, rather than the small finger muscles that cramped and stiffened after a single page. By 1912, the A.N. Palmer Company in Cedar Rapids was selling 1 million copies of its penmanship workbooks annually, with teacher instruction guides moving through school districts across the country. The trade press of the era called what happened to students in those classrooms Palmerization. Sensation lived in your forearm, and you could tell the difference between the 2 kinds of writing by the end of the first week. Finger writing was tight and cramped. After 2 or 3 lines, the hand ached and the letters degraded. Arm writing, the Palmer way, was open and rolling, with a rhythm built into it that a person could sustain across a full page without stopping. The teacher would sometimes count aloud or tap on her desk with a ruler to set the pace before she began her walk between rows. Oval, oval, oval. Push, pull, push, pull. The sound of 30 children moving their pencils across paper in the same direction at roughly the same moment had a texture to it, a soft collective friction that did not sound like anything else in the school day. Some classrooms in the early 1960s still held desks manufactured in the 1940s, the kind with a small round hole in the upper right corner originally meant for an ink bottle. You knew what the hole was for, even if you had never seen one in use. The desk held the memory of an earlier version of the same lesson. Penmanship carried weight beyond the gradebook. For black families in the 1960s, a child who wrote clearly was a child who could hold themselves up in rooms that had historically denied them entry. A clean hand on a job application, a letter to a landlord, a form at a bank counter was not a minor skill. It was a credential, visible proof of education and seriousness, in situations where the margin for being dismissed was already thin. The adults in your life understood this without having to explain it. When your grandmother wrote in a hand that could have been set by a printing press, she was carrying something her generation had been held to and had decided to pass forward. The penmanship period at school was the same standard moving through you. Zaner Bloser had been competing with Palmer from nearly the beginning. Founded in Columbus, Ohio, in the 1890s, The company produced its own penmanship curriculum, and different school districts made different choices between the two systems. But the underlying principle was identical everywhere. Handwriting was a discipline, it had an external standard, and your letters were graded the same way your arithmetic was graded. Your lowercase a had a correct form. Your capital Q had a specific looping motion that looked like nothing you had ever drawn before you learned it, and became automatic shortly after. The angle of your paper mattered. The pressure of your pencil on the page mattered. You could press too hard and the teacher would see it in the heaviness of the lines. The teacher always noticed. By 1946, 66% of American schools were teaching manuscript printing first and introducing cursive later, typically in the 3rd grade. That transition was its own event inside the larger subject. You moved from letters that stood separately to letters that connected, and for several weeks in 3rd grade, the connection was the entire lesson. How the lowercase e ended and reached toward the next letter. How the finished with a small exit stroke. How the capital letters, which followed different rules than their lowercase counterparts, had to be learned almost over again. How the letters flowed into one another and became a word rather than a row of separate marks. Your name was one of the first things you wrote in cursive, practiced on the same sheet until it looked the same every time, and that repetition of your own name until it was correct was a version of everything the class had ever asked of you. You practiced it in the same period, on the same line sheets, with the same correction applied to the same mistakes, until the mistakes stopped appearing. Palmer stopped publishing penmanship textbooks in the early 1980s. By then, educator Donald Thurber had introduced the Donnellian system in 1978, a simpler method that slanted letters in a way meant to ease the transition from printing to cursive, and the home computer had begun making the question of handwriting feel like something belonging to an earlier decade. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 put standardized testing in math and reading at the center of school accountability, and subjects without a test attached to them lost instructional time across the country. When 46 states adopted the Common Core state standards in 2010, those standards included no requirement to teach cursive at all. Some states have since passed individual laws restoring the requirement, but the dedicated penmanship period, the one with its own paper and its own rhythm, and its own teacher moving between rows and repositioning your arm without asking, has not come back with them. What the Palmer method actually demanded was a specific kind of discipline, physical, measurable, and indifferent to your preferences. Your handwriting was not supposed to express who you were. It was supposed to match the model on the board. The individual variation in your letters was something to be corrected out of you, not preserved. If your lowercase g looked wrong, you practiced the g until it did not. That was the whole agreement. The school would teach your body what correct felt like, and your body would produce letters that any reader could move through without effort. You did not learn this because someone made the case for it. You learned it because the room was arranged to teach it, and you were in the room, and that was simply how the table worked. Your hands carried that training into everything that came after. Another class used the same logic, the same dedicated room built for a single purpose, the same measured repetition, and applied it to a completely different machine. One with keys, and it made noise when you touched them. That one is next. Section 2. Typing keys on a manual typewriter required actual force, not the soft depression of a modern keyboard, not the slight pressure of a touchscreen. You press down with enough weight to drive a metal arm through the air, strike an ink ribbon, and leave a clean impression on the paper beneath it. Too light and the letter ghosted, pale and incomplete. Too heavy and the arm stuck against the ribbon for half a second and smeared. The teacher did not explain what the right pressure felt like. The machine explained it, through the quality of the letter it left on the page, and you adjusted until the letters came out even and dark. Typing class had its own room. Not borrowed space, not a corner of a larger classroom. A dedicated room lined with machines, usually 15 or 20 of them, one per student, arranged in rows facing the front. The machines in most schools through the early 1960s were manual models. Royal, Remington, and Underwood were the names you saw on the fronts of them, each machine heavy enough that you could not pick it up casually. Each one fitted with a spring-loaded carriage that moved left one stop with every keystroke and rang a small bell near the right margin to warn you the line was ending. You pushed a lever with your left hand at the end of every line, and the carriage slid back to the right with a sound like a small drawer closing hard. That rhythm, keystroke and bell, and return, repeated across a room full of machines at once, was the sound of the typing period. There is no sound in a modern school that comes close to it. The first lesson was the home row. Your left hand rested on a SDF, and your right hand rested on JKL and the semicolon key. That was the starting position, and you came back to it after every reach to another part of the keyboard. The teacher called out letters, and you typed them without looking down. Eyes forward, on the board or on a printed passage set in a stand beside the machine. Looking at your hands was a practical failure. A typist who watched the keys could not sustain speed, because the eyes could not travel between page and keyboard fast enough to keep pace with trained fingers. Touch typing was the entire point. Your fingers were supposed to learn the keyboard the way your arm had learned the Palmer oval, through repetition, until the knowledge moved out of the conscious mind and into the muscle, and stayed there. Speed was measured in words per minute, and the measurement was serious. A typing test at the end of a semester was timed, scored for accuracy, and recorded. 40 words per minute was a reasonable mark for a student finishing a first term. 60 was strong. 80 was the level a working secretary at a downtown firm might be expected to hold over a full day. A job advertisement in a newspaper from that era would specify a words per minute minimum, alongside a shorthand speed minimum, the two skills understood to belong in the same person. The typing teacher knew exactly what work her students were being prepared for, and she taught with that destination in mind. That destination was not equally offered. Typing class in most schools was pointed primarily at girls. School counselors who built student schedules in the early 1960s directed girls toward business education, which included typing alongside shorthand and bookkeeping, and directed boys toward college preparatory tracks or vocational shop classes. A boy who ended up in typing was treated as though he had taken a wrong turn. A girl who was college-bound still usually took typing, because the adults around her understood that even a college-educated woman might need to earn money quickly, and office work was one of the few professional avenues reliably open to her. Nobody presented it as a choice. For black girls and women, typing carried a different and specific weight. Access to office work had been largely closed to black women through most of the first half of the 20th century, regardless of skill or education level. Federal agencies began opening clerical positions to black workers during and after World War II, and private employers in northern cities followed through the 1950s and into the 1960s, unevenly but measurably. A black woman who could type quickly and accurately held a credential that was visible, testable, and harder to dismiss than a degree from a school a hiring manager had never heard of. The typing room at school was narrow preparation for a narrow opening, but it was a real one, and the women who moved through it understood what they were actually being given. IBM introduced the Selectric typewriter on July 31, 1961, and it disrupted the industry immediately. Where older machines used individual metal arms that swung forward to strike the ribbon, the Selectric used a single rotating element, roughly the size and shape of a golf ball, covered in embossed characters that spun and tilted into position before striking. The result was a machine that could not jam, that produced cleaner type, and that ran with a more controlled, quieter sound. By the mid-1970s, the Selectric line held approximately 75% of the electric typewriter market in the United States. Most schools through the early 1960s, however, could not commit the funds to electric models and continued training students on manual machines, which meant that when those students moved into offices equipped with Selectrics, the adjustment felt like stepping off a dirt road onto pavement. The keys responded to almost nothing compared to what their fingers had been trained against. By the 1970s, electric machines had replaced manual models in most high school typing rooms. A generation of students learned the home row on machines that answered to a lighter touch and moved faster than anything their older siblings had practiced on. The typing room had gone from a space that smelled of ribbon ink and machine oil and the particular warmth of metal to a space that smelled of nothing much at all. The machines were quieter. The carriage bell was the same, but the return was easier. The room was still doing what it had always done, but the equipment had softened around the edges. Word processors arrived in the 1980s, and personal computers followed close behind, and within a decade the dedicated typing class had begun dissolving into something called keyboarding, taught on computer terminals, measured differently, built around software rather than a mechanical skill. The bell at the end of the line was gone. The carriage return was gone. The resistance of the key was gone. Schools began treating typing as something students would absorb through ordinary computer use, and the dedicated room, with its rows of identical machines and its timed tests and its teacher reading speed off a stopwatch, became difficult to find in most districts by the mid-1990s. What that room had actually taught was a particular kind of physical accountability. A mistyped letter did not vanish. You could not press a key and pretend it had not happened. The error stayed on the page, visible, while you kept moving. That was simply the arrangement. The machine recorded what your fingers did, and you lived with it or you corrected it, and either way the page held the evidence. Nobody had to explain what accuracy meant in a typing room. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Your hands learned something real in both of those rooms. Another classroom was built around an entirely different kind of skill, and it smelled nothing like either of those spaces. It smelled like heat and food and something being made from scratch. That one is coming up next. Section 3. Home economics. Smell reached you before the door opened. Something baked, or something fried, or something simmering on a burner in the back of the room that had been going since first period, and whatever it was had moved into the hallway and settled there by the time you arrived for class. The home economics room did not smell like the rest of the school. It had its own air, layered with cooking and fabric, and the particular warm closeness of a room that had sinks and stoves and electric machines running most of the day. You stepped through the door, and the school outside disappeared for the period, replaced by something that felt older and more serious. The same way a kitchen at home felt more serious than the living room. Home economics was built as a room within a room. On the cooking side, student stations had their own burners, their own counters, their own assigned drawer of utensils. On the sewing side, the machines were built into long tables, pedal mechanisms set below the surface, a row of spools and bobbins arranged along the wall. The teacher moved between the two halves of the room depending on which half needed her, and she ran both sides with the same economy of motion. Demonstration first, correction as you worked. No explaining what she had already shown you. First project was usually an apron. Simple construction, straight seams, the kind of thing that taught you how to cut a pattern, pin fabric, and run a line through a machine without your hands drifting. After the apron, a shift dress. After the dress, something harder. You built up the same way you built anything else in a school, from the simplest version of the skill toward the version that required judgment. The Smith-Hughes National Vocational Education Act of 1917, signed by President Woodrow Wilson on February 23rd of that year, had put federal money behind home economics instruction and locked it into the curriculum of schools across the country for nearly 5 decades. The act matched state funding to pay the salaries of home economics teachers and set standards for what the subject had to cover: food preparation, sewing and textiles, household management, family budgeting. It was the first time the federal government had made that kind of commitment to a domestic curriculum, and the result was that home economics classrooms became a standard feature of American secondary schools from the 1920s forward. By the time you sat in one of those chairs in the 1960s, the room had been there for a long time, longer than most of the teachers, longer than most of the parents. The cooking curriculum covered more than recipes. You learned how to read a recipe card and follow it without improvising, because improvising was how a dish failed and you had to explain it to the class. You learned measurement as a serious skill, the difference between a packed cup and a leveled one, between a tablespoon and a teaspoon, between folding and stirring. Some students kept their recipe cards in small metal boxes and rubbed white candle wax across the surface of each card to protect it from grease and steam, a practical technique the teacher demonstrated once and students adopted quietly without discussion. You learned to set a table correctly, with the fork on the left and the knife blade turned in, and you were graded on it. You learned what a balanced meal looked like across the 4 food groups the federal government had been publishing since 1956. And you learned that balance was not optional, it was the point. Home economics was one of the earliest professional fields in America where women of different races moved into positions of authority. The journalist Danielle Dreilinger, writing a full history of the subject, found that Black women had led agriculture, science, and nutrition education within the field from early on, working in government agencies and university extension programs at a time when most professional doors remained closed. In the 1960s, family and consumer scientists were safety testing food for NASA astronauts, a detail far removed from the Apron Project, but part of the same chain. Inside the classroom, though, the subject's relationship to Black girls carried a more complicated weight. Teaching a Black girl to cook and sew and manage a household budget inside a system that had historically channeled Black women into domestic labor in other people's homes was not a neutral act. Every woman in those classrooms understood the double edge. The skill was real, and the skill was useful, and the skill had been used against them, and you learned it anyway, because knowledge belonged to you once you had it, regardless of what anyone else had intended. The sewing half of the class had its own particular discipline. You learned to cut a commercial pattern by pinning the tissue paper to the fabric along the grain line, not against it, and the teacher explained once why the grain line mattered and did not explain it again. You learned to hand-baste a seam before running it through the machine, a slower method that meant the machine seam came out straight. The sound of a 1960s home economics classroom during a sewing period had layers to it. The hum of a machine running at full speed, Another machine starting and stopping as someone stitched a curve. The snip of scissors through fabric. A seam ripper going through a line that had not come out right. 20 machines in one room made a collective sound that was nothing like silence and nothing like noise. It was work. You could hear the work from the hallway. The Vocational Education Act of 1963 began dismantling the federal funding structure that the Smith-Hughes Act had established, narrowing the definition of what qualified for support and requiring that home economics instruction lead toward gainful employment to receive funds. That standard worked against a subject built around household skills that were rarely compensated as employment. The feminist movement that gathered force through the late 1960s and into the 1970s accelerated the pressure. Home economics was read by many as a mechanism for directing girls toward domesticity, and the argument was not wrong, even if the skills themselves were real. Schools began cutting programs in the 1970s and eliminating them in the 1980s. By 1994, the subject had been renamed in most districts as Family and Consumer Sciences, a title designed to carry no gender assumption and teach no particular household arrangement. The kitchens and the sewing machines were still there in some places, but the mandatory period, the one that put every girl in the same room for the same class, had already ended in most of the country by the time the name changed. What that room had actually done was teach you to make something from raw material and finish it, not describe how to make it, not watch someone else make it. You cut the fabric, you sewed the seam, you turned the garment right side out, and you wore it, or you kept it, or you used it. A dish you cooked in that room you ate at the end of the period, standing at the counter, still warm. Nobody had to explain why that mattered. You could taste it. Another room in the same school building worked with a different kind of material, and it smelled nothing like this one. It smelled of sawdust and machine oil, and something raw being shaped into something finished. That one is next. Section 4. Woodshop. Sawdust settled on everything by the end of the first period. On your forearms, on your collar, in the crease where your sleeve met your wrist. It had a smell that was nothing like the rest of the school. Something dry and alive at the same time. Pine or oak or whatever the current project called for. Mixed with the heavier smell of machine oil and the particular sharpness of fresh-cut wood that hit the back of your nose when a board went through the table saw. You could smell the shop room from down the hallway before you reached it. The same way you could smell the home economics room, but the shop smelled like something being torn apart rather than something being made ready to eat. Both smells meant work. They just meant different kinds. Woodshop had its own architecture. Long wooden workbenches ran down the center of the room, each one fitted with a heavy vise at one end. The power tools stood along the walls and in their own stations around the floor. The table saw, the band saw, the drill press, the wood lathe, the belt sander. Delta Manufacturing had been producing school-grade equipment since the 1930s, and by the 1960s, the Delta 15-inch drill press was a standard fixture in high school shops across the country. A floor-standing machine heavy enough that it did not move when you pressed into it, and built to outlast the students who used it by several decades. Many of those machines are still running today in the shops that kept them. The tools in the room were not toys and were not treated as such. The teacher went through the safety rules on day one and did not repeat them, which meant that the weight of the machinery settled into you on the first day and stayed. The curriculum had a structure that matched most other shop programs in the country. You started with hand tools and graduated to power tools only after the teacher had watched you work. First project was usually something simple: a board squared with a hand plane, a set of bookends, a small cutting board, a magazine rack. The hand plane came first because it was the foundation. If you could not move a plane across a board and produce a flat, even surface, you were not ready for anything that spun or cut at speed. The plane required you to read the wood, to feel when the blade was too deep or too shallow, to adjust without being told what the adjustment should be. The teacher might stand beside you once and demonstrate. After that, you worked until the surface was right, or explained why it was not. The magazine rack or the bookends that came after were graded on measurement accuracy, smooth finish, and square corners. And the grade meant what it said, because a piece that was not square was a piece that did not work. Industrial arts, which was the formal name for the subject that included wood shop, metal shop, and related courses, had been part of American public schools since the early 20th century and was federally supported through the Smith-Hughes Act from 1917 forward. The idea behind industrial arts was straightforward. A student who could work with materials and tools was a student who could enter the workforce prepared, and a prepared workforce served the country. That argument made sense in an economy that needed people who could build and repair physical things. and through the post-war period, when manufacturing was the center of American economic life, it held. In a 1965 high school, the whine of a drill press from one hallway and a literature class recitation from the next were both understood as necessary preparation for different parts of the same world. What happened to woodshop happened over 2 decades, and it happened for reasons that were not simple. Tracking had been built into American secondary education since before World War II. Students entered high school and were sorted into one of 3 paths: college preparatory, general education, or vocational. Shop class, along with other hands-on courses, sat in the vocational track. The sorting was supposed to reflect aptitude and interest. What studies through the 1960s and 1970s found was that it reflected race and income more reliably than either. Working-class students and racial minority students with academic records comparable to their college prep peers were placed in vocational tracks at higher rates. In 1967, a federal circuit court examining the Washington, D.C. school system in the case known as Hobson versus Hansen found the tracking system unconstitutional, in part because the aptitude tests used to place students were standardized toward middle-class white students and produced results that reflected that bias. The vocational track, the court found, was functioning as a mechanism for sorting students away from academic opportunity along lines of race and class. For Black students and their families, this history made shop class a complicated room to be in. The skills taught there were real, and the craftsmanship involved was genuine. A student who could read a set of plans, operate a lathe, cut a board to within a 1/16 of an inch, and finish a surface smoothly, had learned something actual. But the path into the room was corrupted, and everybody knew it. A Black boy placed in shop class by a guidance counselor who had already decided he was not college material was not making a choice. He was receiving a verdict. That distinction mattered to Black families, who had spent decades arguing that their children deserved access to the same academic preparation that white families assumed as a default. When the School to Work Opportunities Act of 1994 brought a new push for vocational education back into policy conversation, communities of color pushed back hard, specifically because the rhetoric of the trades felt like a return to the same routing that had kept generations of Black and brown students out of college preparatory classrooms. The backlash was not against the skills, it was against who was being told to learn them and who was making that decision. What the shop room actually produced, when it worked, was a particular kind of accountability. A joint that did not fit told you immediately. There was no partial credit for a cut that was a 1/4 inch off, because a 1/4 inch off meant the piece did not assemble correctly, and an assembled piece either held together or it did not. The machine was more honest than most teachers in that sense. You could not argue with the fit of a tenon in a mortise. You could not explain your way past a split in the wood caused by driving a screw too close to the edge. The project told you what you had done and what you needed to do again, and the noise and the dust and the particular satisfaction of a surface that came out smooth under your hand were the conditions in which that education happened. Nobody had to explain why any of it mattered. The finished object was right there on the bench in front of you. Shop classes began declining through the 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s, as school boards, under pressure to improve college enrollment rates, cut courses that did not feed the college application. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 required schools to be measured on standardized test performance in math and reading, and shop class did not produce test scores. By the early 2000s, 90% of woodshop and related courses had been eliminated from the Los Angeles Unified School District. Seattle, which had once been a national leader in vocational education, with shop programs running in more than a dozen middle schools and 17 high school programs through the 1970s, was down to 4 programs by the time anyone counted carefully. The equipment that survived ended up at auction, in storage, or in the hands of community colleges that absorbed the tools along with whatever muscle memory the teachers still carried. What was lost was not just a class. A particular kind of physical reasoning, the ability to look at a material problem and work backward from the finished object to the sequence of steps required to produce it, used to be taught in a room that smelled of sawdust and ran on the sound of machines. That reasoning is harder to find now. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 4 subjects down, and each one of those rooms taught you something with your hands. The next room taught you something different: how your country was supposed to work, who held power, and what you were allowed to do about it. That one is coming up next. Section 5. Civics. Your civics teacher kept a newspaper folded on the corner of the desk, not as decoration, as material. In the course called Problems of Democracy, which was one of 3 separate required civics courses in most American high schools through the 1960s, current events were the actual curriculum. You read what was happening in the world that week, and you discussed it in class, out loud, in a room where the teacher was specifically paid to lead that conversation. Local government, national legislation, the rights of citizens, the structure of power, who held it and how it was supposed to be transferred, and by what rules, all of it was taught as a course of study with its own period, its own textbook, and its own grade that appeared on your transcript. 3 courses. That was what civics meant in a 1960s public school, and the 3 were distinct. The first, simply called civics, was typically taught in the 9th grade and focused on how government worked at the local and state level, what a city council did, how a school board was formed, what a county commissioner had authority over, how an ordinance became law. The second, problems of democracy, came later and moved the lens outward to current events and national issues. Students debated, they read, they were expected to have opinions that they could defend with something more than feeling. The third course was U.S. government, which covered the structure of the federal system, the 3 branches, their specific powers, the mechanics of separation, and the logic of checks. Before the 1960s ended, you could graduate from an American high school having spent 3 separate years thinking formally about what a citizen was supposed to do and why. Problems of democracy was the most alive of the 3. 9th grade civics covered structure, and structure could be dry. Problems of democracy was built around argument. A social studies teacher who worked through the 1950s and 1970s described keeping magazine covers of world leaders along a wall ledge throughout the semester, using each new development in the news to connect current events back to the history being covered elsewhere in the curriculum. By the mid-1960s, those conversations included the civil rights movement, legislative battles in Congress, and protests against the war in Vietnam, topics with enough weight that the classroom could become genuinely uncomfortable and the teacher could not retreat into the safe distance of a textbook that was already out of date. The newspaper on the desk meant the subject was living, not settled, and the student in the chair was a citizen preparing to act, not a vessel being filled. For Black students in the 1960s, civics class carried a weight that no textbook included, and no teacher was required to address. You sat in a room learning the mechanics of democratic participation, how to register, how to vote, how to petition, how a representative was held accountable, while the adults in your life navigated a country that was working hard to keep them from doing most of those things. By 1961, in 69 Mississippi counties where Black people made up 37.7% of the voting age population, only 6.2% were registered to vote. In 13 of those counties, not a single Black person was on the rolls. You could learn all 3 civics courses by heart and walk out of the classroom into a system whose every layer had been arranged to make the lesson irrelevant for you. The gap between the classroom and the front steps of the county registrar's office was not a gap the textbook acknowledged. What the white school board of Bolivar County, Mississippi, made official was what many counties across the South practiced by habit. The board issued a formal mandate stating that neither foreign languages nor civics should be taught in Negro schools. Not as a quiet exclusion, as a written rule. The reason was not complicated, and nobody pretended it was. A Black community that understood how government worked, who held power, and what the law actually said, was a Black community harder to control and harder to exclude. Mississippi was spending $81.66 per year to educate a white student and $21.77 per year to educate a Black student in the early 1960s, a ratio that captured the relative value the state placed on the futures of those children. Withholding civics from Black schools was the same logic applied to a specific subject. Knowledge of how power worked was itself a form of power, and the people who held the power were not interested in distributing it through a 9th grade class. The Freedom Schools built in Mississippi during the summer of 1964 understood this clearly and responded directly. Organized by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as part of Freedom Summer, nearly 40 Freedom Schools opened across the state, serving close to 2,500 students, including adults. Civics was at the center of the curriculum, not as a subject separated from daily life, but as preparation for the specific act of attempting to register to vote, an act that carried real risk in Mississippi in 1964 and that required a working knowledge of constitutional rights that no county registrar was going to explain. The Freedom Schools taught civics as something that had been taken from you and that you were reclaiming, rather than something being handed down from a state curriculum office. That distinction mattered. The mainstream civics curriculum began its long decline through the 1970s, and the reasons were not simple. Vietnam and Watergate did to civic trust what shop class tracking did to vocational education. They made the subject seem dishonest at its core. If the government had conducted a war through sustained public deception, and if the president had committed criminal acts inside the White House itself, then a class built around the premise that democratic institutions were trustworthy and worth understanding had a credibility problem. The agreement that had made civics feel like a neutral subject rather than an ideological one was gone. School districts responded by shrinking the curriculum and folding the 3 separate courses into one, typically a single semester on American government that covered the structure of the federal system and stopped well short of the question of what a citizen was supposed to actually do. No Child Left Behind, signed in January 2002, measured schools on reading and mathematics performance and held administrators accountable for those scores. Civics did not produce a score. Instructional time shifted towards subjects that generated numbers that appeared in evaluations, and a subject with no test attached to it lost ground steadily across the following decade. A 2011 report from the Annenberg Public Policy Center documented what that shift had produced. Only 25% of American students reached the proficient standard on the National Assessment of Educational Progress Civics Assessment. White and wealthy students were 4 to 6 times more likely to exceed that standard than Black and Hispanic students from low-income households. The civic achievement gap was running along the same lines as the academic achievement gap, which meant that the communities who had historically been excluded from political power were now also the communities receiving the least preparation to exercise it. What civics class had done, at its best, was take the rules of the room you were living in and lay them out flat on a desk so you could read them. Not to celebrate them, not to pretend they were being followed, to know them, which was a different and more durable thing. You cannot hold something accountable to a standard you do not know. That was simply what the course was for. 3 years of civics class and you learned how the country was supposed to run. Another class from the same era taught you a different kind of speed and precision, on paper, with marks that looked nothing like letters but carried everything letters could carry, faster than any hand could write them plainly. That one is coming up next. Section 6. Shorthand curves, loops, and small ellipses moving across the page in patterns that bore no resemblance to the English language. That was what shorthand looked like in a notebook, and if you had not been trained to read it, the marks told you nothing. A word that took 8 letters to write in longhand might take 1 fluid curve in Gregg shorthand, 2 seconds of pen movement against 11. A full sentence of dictated speech, the kind a boss might deliver while walking around an office with his hands behind his back, could be captured on 2 lines of the narrow steno pad that sat on the corner of every secretary's desk in America. The system was designed for one thing: keeping pace with spoken language at a speed the hand could not otherwise sustain. John Robert Gregg invented his system in 1888, publishing it first in a small pamphlet called Light Line Phonography. He was 18 years old. He brought the system to the United States in 1893, settling eventually in Chicago, and by 1900 he had established the Gregg Publishing Company and begun distributing textbooks to schools and business colleges. Gregg's shorthand was phonetic, which meant it recorded the sounds of speech rather than the spelling of words. Silent letters were omitted entirely. The word knife had a K and an N and an I in the written version, but started with an N sound and was written that way. The word phone and the word fun shared the same symbol for their opening consonant, because the mouth made the same sound regardless of how a dictionary chose to spell the difference. The system was built on elliptical curves and uniform thin lines without the shading or angular strokes that made competing systems like Pitman shorthand slower to produce. By the time John Robert Gregg died in 1948, the majority of public schools in the United States were teaching his system. Shorthand class ran differently from typing class. Typing was mechanical repetition. Press the key, the letter appears. Shorthand was memory and movement working together, and the memory load was substantial. Before you could build speed, you had to learn the brief forms, which were the shorthand symbols for the most common words in English. The, and, is, that, have, from, with, for, be. Each one was a specific mark you memorized as a whole unit, the same way you memorized a multiplication table. Once the brief forms were in your hand, you learned the consonant strokes and the vowel positions, and the system began to open up. You could write any word you heard, not just the ones you had memorized, as long as you could break the sound down correctly and trace the right ellipse or curve. The teacher would read aloud and you would write, and the goal was to reproduce on the page everything that came out of the air around you, without the words getting ahead of your hand. Speed was measured against a clock and against a professional standard that appeared in job advertisements. Beginning secretarial positions in the 1960s specified a shorthand speed of 80 words per minute alongside the typing requirement in the help wanted columns. An experienced secretary was expected to sustain 100 words per minute or better over a full dictation session. Court reporters, who used the same system to capture legal proceedings in real time, needed to reach 225 words per minute with 90% accuracy, a level of speed that required years of dedicated practice and produce notes that only another trained reader could decipher. The Smithsonian holds a cardboard speed certificate awarded to a shorthand student in 1944 for writing at 100 words per minute for 5 continuous minutes. The certificate was a credential with a number attached to it, the same way a typing certificate was, and in an employment market, where credentials were one of the few things a woman could put in front of a hiring manager that was harder to dismiss than a name or a face, a number meant something. For Black women entering the workforce in the 1960s, shorthand represented a particular doorway. Middle-class Black women had been moving into clerical and secretarial work through the 1940s and into the post-war period, as federal agencies and northern private employers opened positions that had previously been closed by explicit policy. A 1940 Women's Bureau survey had found that more than half of employers had a written company policy against hiring Black women as clerical workers. By the 1960s, that wall was cracking in enough places that a Black woman who could demonstrate shorthand speed, alongside typing accuracy, had a credential the employer could measure, without deciding what to do with her, by appearance alone. The skill was the argument, and the argument was in the number. A woman who could take dictation at 100 words per minute and transcribe it accurately on a typewriter by end of business was a woman the office needed, and the shorthand class at school was where that number was built. Shorthand sat inside the business education track alongside typing and bookkeeping, and like both of those subjects, it was directed primarily at girls. Boys in the same school walked toward shop and drafting. Girls in the business track were being prepared for specific occupations in specific rooms, and the occupations were not questioned in most schools until the late 1960s, when the same feminist pressure that began dismantling home economics started pressing against the assumption that business education for women meant preparing them to work for men. By then, the class had been running for decades, and the women who came through it had used it to build careers that were real and paid and professional, whatever the gender assumptions that surrounded the subject. The dictation machine began replacing the shorthand notebook in American offices during the 1960s and accelerated through the 1970s. An executive who could dictate a letter into a small recording device on his desk and pass the tape to a typist eliminated the need for a trained stenographer to be in the room during dictation. The tape did not require anyone to decipher handwritten curves from a steno pad. It could be played back at reduced speed, paused, rewound. By the early 1970s, office supply manufacturers were advertising dictation equipment as a solution that freed executives from scheduling dictation sessions and freed companies from paying the premium that accompanied a high-speed shorthand credential. The business case for shorthand had rested entirely on speed, and once a machine could match the speed without requiring years of training to operate, the case collapsed. Shorthand was mostly gone from school curricula by the 1990s, replaced first by the dictation machine, and then dissolved entirely by word processing software that made the transcription step itself less necessary. What shorthand had required of you was a form of translation that happened inside the body, in real time, without review. Speech arrived and your hand moved, and the page held whatever accuracy your training had built into the motion. There was no chance to go back and reconsider the vowel position of a word while the next sentence was already in the air. The dictation moved and you moved with it, and the speed you had was the speed you had. Nobody in the room could give you more. That was simply the arrangement. A notebook full of shorthand curves was a private document that only 2 people on Earth could read: the writer and anyone else who had been through the same training. That kind of precision, that kind of contained and transferable knowledge, belonged to you completely once you had it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 6 subjects in, and every one of them put something into your hands that you carried into adulthood without knowing you were carrying it. The next one put the whole world on a wall instead, every country in its place, every border drawn to scale, and it asked you to know where things were. That one is next. Section 7, Driver's Education. Brake pedal on the passenger side, placed there for one reason. The instructor needed to be able to stop the car faster than you could. You were in the driver's seat, learning something that could kill you if you did it wrong, and the school had taken that possibility seriously enough to retrofit the vehicle with a second set of controls that sat between the instructor's feet and allowed them to override whatever your feet were doing at any given moment. 2 or 3 other students rode in the back seat as observers, watching you work through the left turn, or the parallel park, or the highway entry that they would be asked to repeat on their own scheduled day behind the wheel. Nobody in the car was relaxed. That was simply the arrangement, and it was different from every other class in the building because every other class took place in a room where nothing you did could hurt anyone. Driver's education was a full course with classroom and in-car components. The classroom portion covered the rules of the road, traffic signs, right-of-way laws, and the specific regulations of your state's vehicle code, all of it testable and tested, the same kind of graded knowledge that English and civics required. The in-car portion put you behind a real wheel on a real road with real traffic, under the supervision of a teacher who sat close enough to smell whatever you had eaten for lunch. The curriculum that Amos Nehart, a professor of industrial engineering at Penn State University, had designed when he started the first high school driver education course in 1934 at State College High School in Pennsylvania, called for 45 hours of classroom instruction, 24 hours of in-car observation, and 8 hours of actual behind-the-wheel time per student. Nehart had started the program using his own 1929 Graham Page automobile, which he had outfitted himself with a rudimentary dual control system at his own expense, and the program had nearly folded for lack of funding before the State College Rotary Club stepped in to keep it running. By the time you sat in a school driver's ed car in the 1960s, the subject had traveled from one professor's personal vehicle to over 13,000 schools teaching more than 1.7 million students annually. The growth happened fast because the argument for it was simple and backed by numbers. In 1936, the Travelers Insurance Company released data showing that 30% of all automobile accidents involving fatalities were caused by drivers between the ages of 16 and 24, a group that accounted for 22% of accidents causing non-fatal injuries. Young drivers were the problem, and the solution was preparation. By 1968, Nehart had personally trained nearly 20,000 driving instructors across the country. Pontiac had partnered with the American Automobile Association as early as 1936 to supply dual-control cars to school districts. And by the 1960s, those cars were typically whatever American model the district could afford or negotiate. A Chevrolet or a Ford or a Plymouth with the secondary brake and sometimes a secondary clutch mounted on a bracket near the floorboard on the passenger side. The cars smelled like 4 different students a day, 5 days a week, month after month. A specific combination of nervousness and vinyl, and the particular warm engine smell of a car that had been in and out of traffic all afternoon. Signal 30 arrived in the classroom before the car did. Produced in 1959 by Highway Safety Films in Mansfield, Ohio, in collaboration with the Ohio State Highway Patrol, the 28-minute film took its name from the radio code the patrol used for a fatal accident. The film showed what fatal accidents actually looked like. The vehicles, the road, and the people who had been in them, without staging, without distance, without any of the softening that a fictional recreation might have provided. Director Richard Wayman and narrator Wayne Byers presented the footage as evidence, organized by cause, speeding, failure to yield, driving under the influence. By 1970, an estimated 40 million students had watched it in driver's education classrooms across the country, and it won a National Safety Council award. Other films followed in the same mode. Red Asphalt, produced by the California Highway Patrol in 1964. Mechanized Death, Wheels of Tragedy, Highways of Agony. You watched in a darkened classroom, and the images that came off the projector screen were not images that stayed in the short-term memory. They went somewhere deeper. That was the point. For black teenagers in the 1960s, the road carried a layer of risk that Signal 30 did not address, and that the driver's education curriculum was not built to prepare them for. The mechanical dangers the films cataloged were real and equal. A high-speed collision was equally catastrophic regardless of the driver's race. But the geography of the American road was not equal, and every black family that owned a car understood this before any teenager in the household reached driving age. Victor Hugo Green, a postal worker from Harlem, had been publishing the Negro Motorist Green Book annually since 1936, a guide listing hotels, restaurants, gas stations, beauty parlors, and private homes where black travelers could stop without risk of refusal, humiliation, or violence. The guide covered the country and was updated every year because the information in it could change. A hotel under new ownership might no longer be safe. A gas station that had served black customers might stop. Green had written in the guide that there would come a day when it would no longer need to be published, when black Americans would have the same freedom of movement that the open road implied. The guide ran through its last edition in 1966, after the Civil Rights Act had made legal discrimination a violation of federal law. The world the Green Book documented was the world black teenagers were being taught to drive into. Sundown towns, municipalities where posted signs or unposted custom-made, it understood that black people needed to be out of the town limits by dark, existed across the country in both the North and the South. Indiana, Illinois, and Oregon had them as well as Mississippi and Alabama. In 1968, in the sundown town of Martinsville, Indiana, a young black woman named Carol Jenkins was killed while selling encyclopedias door to door. Black families who traveled by car-packed food, carried portable gasoline containers, and planned overnight stops with relatives or known contacts to avoid having to stop in unfamiliar places where the risk of encountering a hostile sheriff or a hostile community was real and not theoretical. Civil rights leader Julian Bond said it plainly. It did not matter where you went, Jim Crow was everywhere. A black teenager who learned to drive in driver's education class was learning a mechanical skill in a school parking lot and also learning to navigate a geography the class did not name and the instructor could not teach. Driver's education remained in the mainstream through the 1970s. National surveys from that decade found that 95% of American teenagers were learning to drive in school-based programs. The decline came through the 1980s as school districts under budget pressure evaluated which courses were expensive to run and could be outsourced. A driver's education course required cars, which required maintenance and insurance and liability coverage, and a designated instructor who spent most of the day in traffic rather than in a classroom. Private driving schools offered to take on the responsibility for a fee paid by families, and school boards accepted that transfer readily. By the time No Child Left Behind redirected school resources toward tested academic subjects, driver's education had already been leaving the curriculum for a decade. Currently, only 32 states require any form of driver's education for licensure, and most of those requirements can be met through private instruction rather than school programs. What the school course had provided, that the private alternative did not, was access regardless of ability to pay. A family that could not afford a private driving school produced a teenager who could not easily meet the requirement, and in a country where a driver's license functions as the primary form of identification and personal mobility as the primary form of economic access, the gap between the teenager with a school course available and the teenager without was not small. Nobody had to explain what a license meant. You already knew. Another class from the same era asked you to learn a different kind of roadmap, one drawn in a language no living person had spoken as their native tongue for over 1,000 years. It reached backward farther than anything else on this list, and it left something in you that moved forward into everything else. That one is next. Section 8. Latin nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, vocative. 6 cases, and you had them in that order before you had read a single sentence of actual Latin. That was where the class started, not with a story or a place or a person from ancient Rome, but with a grammar chart copied from the board into the front pages of a notebook, 6 words across the top, and 5 noun declensions running down the left side, a table of 30 cells that had to be memorized before any of the cells meant anything. Once you could move through the chart in order, eyes closed, without hesitating at the dative singular of the third declension, the teacher began the sentences. Latin was a required course in many American high schools through the mid-20th century, and in 1962 the public school system had 702,000 students enrolled in it across the country. The subject had deep roots in American education, reaching back to a time when Harvard and Yale required Latin for admission, and when a student who could not translate Cicero was not considered educated by any serious definition. The argument for Latin was not that anyone needed to speak it, because no one did, but that it organized the English language in a way that studying English directly could not accomplish. 60% of English vocabulary derives from Latin roots, and a student who had worked through 2 or 3 years of the language understood those roots in the body rather than in the dictionary, recognizing them without having to look them up, using them in writing with the precision that comes from understanding where a word actually comes from. Studies from the mid-20th century found that high school students who had completed 2 years of Latin consistently achieved higher scores on tests of vocabulary and grammar than students who had studied modern languages for the same period. That result was not surprising to anyone who had sat through the conjugation drills. The curriculum followed a standard sequence that had been in place for generations. First year was grammar, the 5 noun declensions, the 4 verb conjugations, the ablative of means, and the dative of indirect object, and the difference between the subjunctive and the indicative, and why it mattered for translation. All of it committed to memory through the same kind of daily drilling that penmanship had used for the oval and push-pull. Second year was Caesar, specifically his account of the Gallic Wars, a text famous for its clear prose and its relentless use of military vocabulary about siege works and cavalry maneuvers, and the subordination of Gallic tribes. Third year was Cicero, whose sentences were longer, whose syntax was more elaborate, and whose political subject matter required a different kind of attention than Caesar's battlefield reportage. Fourth year was Virgil, the Aeneid in particular, which used a different register entirely, the compressed language of Latin poetry, with its word order inverted from anything natural, and its sounds designed to be read aloud in a specific meter. Translation was the core skill. You picked up a Latin sentence and worked backward from the verb, because the verb in a Latin sentence came last and determined what everything else was doing. The verb told you the action. The noun endings told you who was doing it, who it was being done to, and with what means. A single sentence that would take 10 words in English could accomplish the same thing in 4 Latin words, because the ending of each word carried the grammatical information that English expressed through word order. Working through that compression, finding the verb, identifying the subject by its nominative ending, locating the object by its accusative ending, assembling the meaning in the right direction, was a specific kind of puzzle that required attention of a different quality than reading a paragraph in English. The moment a sentence unlocked, all its parts settling into the right relationship, was its own reward, the same feeling as a combination lock opening after several failed attempts. The National Defense Education Act of 1958, passed in the year after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik and set off a national panic about American competitiveness in science and technology, directed federal funding to mathematics, science, and modern foreign languages. Latin was explicitly excluded from the Act's support at the K-12 level. The reasoning was practical. French and Spanish and German could be used for immediate communication with allies and trading partners, and, in the case of Russian, with the adversary. Latin could not. The Act accelerated a shift in school scheduling and language program funding that was already moving away from classical languages, and the numbers moved accordingly. Between 1962 and 1976, public school Latin enrollment fell 79%, dropping from 702,000 students to 150,000. Roughly the same period, from 1957 to 1973, saw the national average verbal score on the Scholastic Aptitude Test fall 33 points, a correlation that Latin teachers noted and that the broader education establishment mostly did not pursue. By 1976, the language that had once been a college admission requirement had become a specialty elective that only a minority of schools still offered at all. The pressure against Latin came from multiple directions at once. The anti-curriculum movement of the late 1960s argued that students should have more say in what they studied and that irrelevant subjects should give way to content that connected to contemporary life. Latin had spent decades charging itself with being impractical, teaching students vocabulary that they could not use in conversation with any living person. And when the culture shifted toward practical relevance as the standard for educational worth, the charge stuck. Modern foreign language departments, energized by federal funding and a strong argument about global communication, expanded while Latin programs contracted. Schools that could not maintain enough enrollment to justify a dedicated teacher dropped the course rather than share a teacher with another department. Each program that closed produced fewer Latin-trained undergraduates, which produced fewer potential Latin teachers, which produced fewer programs able to stay open. For a subject built around argument and precision, and the careful attention to what a word actually means rather than what it seems to mean, Latin's disappearance from public schools was its own kind of sentence. The textbooks that had governed the grammar translation method for generations, Jenny's first-year Latin for high school students most prominently, remained structurally unchanged through the period of sharpest decline, because the profession that used them could not agree on whether updating the method would help, or simply confirm that the subject had lost its nerve. Today, 8% of American high schools offer any Latin instruction. The number is not growing. What Latin actually gave you, underneath the declension charts and the Caesar drills, was a sustained practice in the idea that words have histories, and those histories matter. The word auditorium came from audere, to hear. The word library came from liber, the word for book. The word salary came from sal, salt, because Roman soldiers were paid in it. Every English word, with a Latin root, carried a small record of where the thing it named had come from, and what people had understood it to mean. Latin class was where that record became legible. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 8 subjects, and every one of them asked you to build something precise with your hands or your mind. The next one took that same precision and put it entirely into numbers, into columns, into the discipline of making two sides of a ledger agree exactly. That one is next. Section 9. Bookkeeping columns already printed on the paper in green ink. A narrow date column on the left, a wider description column beside it, and then the two-sided field of debits and credits running across the right. The ledger arrived ruled and ready, and your job was to fill it correctly. Pencil first, not pen, because entries needed to be correctable, and an incorrect entry in ink required a special procedure of crossing out that left a visible record of the mistake on the page. The eraser was part of the work. The pencil shavings in the tray at the top of the desk were part of the work. The act of filling those columns accurately, in the right order, with numbers that when totaled would prove themselves correct, was what the class was built around, and the proof came at the end. If your debits and credits balanced to the same figure, you were right. If they did not, you went back line by line until you found where they stopped agreeing. Double-entry bookkeeping was 5 centuries old by the time it arrived in your high school business education course. The system was first fully described in print by a Franciscan friar and mathematician named Luca Pacioli in a 1494 work published in Venice, though merchants in Italy had been using versions of it for at least a century before Pacioli wrote it down. The principle was simple in statement and demanding in practice. Every financial transaction had two sides. When a business received cash from a sale, cash went up on the debit side and revenue went up on the credit side. When it paid a bill, an expense went up on the debit side and cash went down on the credit side. Every transaction affected at least 2 accounts, always in balance, and the whole ledger at any moment was a record of every such movement since the books were last closed. If the books were kept correctly, the column of all debits and the column of all credits, added up separately and placed side by side, produced the same number. That equality was the built-in error detection system. The books either balanced or they did not, and if they did not, the error was somewhere in the record, waiting to be found. The class moved through the bookkeeping cycle in order. You kept a journal, which was the daily log where transactions were recorded first, in the sequence they occurred, with a narrative description alongside each entry. Then you posted from the journal to the ledger, which was the organized book of accounts, each account occupying its own page. At the end of the accounting period, you prepared a trial balance, which was the list of all account balances with their debit or credit nature noted, added to a total. If the trial balance balanced, the period was closed, and you moved to the financial statements. If it did not balance, you went back through every journal entry and every posting until you located the number that was in the wrong column or the entry that had been posted to the wrong account. The search was methodical, and it was not optional. The books had to balance. That was simply the rule of the room, the same way a Latin sentence had to parse, and a shorthand speed had to meet the words per minute standard. Bookkeeping lived inside the business education track alongside typing and shorthand, which meant it followed the same social logic as those subjects. It was pointed primarily at students headed for office work, which in the 1960s meant primarily girls. A boy who ended up in bookkeeping was in the same position as a boy who ended up in typing. The school counselor's assumptions had not quite sorted in the usual direction. The class prepared students for positions as bookkeepers and junior accountants at small businesses, department stores, banks, insurance companies, and law offices, entry-level positions that required the ability to maintain accurate records without supervision and to produce a trial balance that a senior accountant or business owner could rely on. A bookkeeper who made errors that survived to the financial statements cost the business money and credibility. A bookkeeper who produced clean books on schedule, month after month, was worth keeping. For Black Americans, the skill of bookkeeping had a specific and documented history that the high school class was part of, without naming it. Mary Thelma Washington, who would become the first Black woman certified public accountant in the United States in 1943, began her career in financial work precisely because someone at a Black-owned bank noticed her bookkeeping skills. Born in 1906 in Vicksburg, Mississippi, she had graduated from Wendell Phillips High School in Chicago and taken a position at Binga State Bank, one of only a handful of Black-owned banks in the country at the time. Arthur Wilson, the bank's vice president and himself the second Black CPA in the United States, recognized what she could do with a ledger and encouraged her to pursue her business degree at Northwestern University. She started her accounting firm in 1939, out of her basement on Chicago's South Side, while she was still studying. By the 1960s, her firm, which had grown into Washington, Pittman, and McKeever, was one of the largest Black-owned accounting firms in the nation. and Chicago had a higher concentration of black CPAs than any other city in the country, a fact that traced directly to her decision to use her practice as a place where young black accountants could gain the work experience the profession required, and most white firms would not provide. Her partner Hiram Pittman described the firm as an underground railroad for black accountants. Professor Jesse Blayton at Morehouse College and Atlanta University, known among black professionals as the Dean of Negro Accountants, spent decades teaching accounting and encouraging black students toward the profession at a time when the barriers between a bookkeeping class in high school and a CPA license were higher for a black student than for any other. His Atlanta firm provided accounting services to Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s. The chain from a high school bookkeeping class to that level of professional practice was long and obstructed and not equally available, but the chain existed, and bookkeeping was where it started. The class gave you the language of accounts and the discipline of balanced records, which was the foundation under everything more complex that came after. Software ended bookkeeping class the same way dictation machines ended shorthand. VisiCalc, the first commercial spreadsheet program, arrived in 1979, and by the mid-1980s, spreadsheet software running on personal computers had made the manual posting of entries to ruled ledger paper a procedure the machine could perform faster and with automatic error detection built in. QuickBooks arrived in 1983 and put small business accounting within reach of anyone who could operate a desktop computer without formal training in the bookkeeping cycle. Schools that had been running bookkeeping courses in the business education track found the justification for the subject disappearing alongside the jobs that had required the skill. By 2019, graduates were averaging less than 1/10 of a credit in finance and less than 2/10 of a credit in office support subjects, a number that measured how completely the business education track had been cleared out of the curriculum. What bookkeeping actually taught was the habit of accounting for things, not estimating, not approximating, not rounding to the nearest reasonable number, accounting for them, in full, in the right column, so that when the period closed and someone asked what had happened to the money, the ledger could answer. The trial balance was the accounting of the period made visible in a single number that either held or did not. Nobody had to explain what accuracy meant inside a bookkeeping room. The columns explained it every time. Pencil and ledger paper did something specific to your attention, sharpening it to the width of a column entry. The next room sharpened it differently, through a completely different kind of machine, one that ran on gasoline rather than arithmetic, and required a completely different part of your brain to understand. That one is next. Section 10. Auto shop. Motor oil settled into everything in an auto shop classroom. Into the knees of the work pants you were told to wear on the first day. Into the weave of the rag that lived in the back pocket of every student who spent more than a week there. Into the shallow grooves of the concrete floor that no amount of sawdust or degreaser fully cleared. The smell of it was different from the woodshop smell, and different from the home economics smell, heavier and older. A smell that had been accumulating in that room since the building went up, and would still be there the day the building came down. You noticed it the first time you walked through the door, and stopped noticing it by the third week, the same way you stopped noticing the chalk smell in a regular classroom, because it simply became the air. Auto shop operated on a different logic from every other vocational class in the school. Wood shop made things. Bookkeeping tracked things. Auto shop fixed things that already existed in the world outside, and that every family in America owned and depended on, and would need fixed again. The car in the shop bay was the same species of machine as the car in your driveway, and the skills you built under school conditions transferred directly to that driveway situation without any intermediate step. The teacher knew this, and taught with it in mind. The teacher in a 1960s auto shop was typically a working mechanic who held factory certifications from Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. Someone who turned wrenches on weekends for money, and came into the classroom on weekdays to pass the knowledge to students who had not yet had the time to acquire it. The class ran the way a real shop ran, a problem to diagnose, a procedure to follow, a result that told you immediately whether the procedure had worked. The cars of the era cooperated with this kind of teaching in a way that no car manufactured after 1980 could match. A 1965 Ford Mustang, or a 1967 Chevrolet Camaro, or a mid-decade Plymouth Fury carried no computers, no sensors reporting fault codes to a diagnostic port, no sealed systems requiring specialized equipment to access. You opened the hood and you could see everything. The engine block, the carburetor sitting on top of it, the distributor with its cap and the plug wires running from it to each cylinder, the battery, the belts, the hoses, the brake fluid reservoir. Every component was visible, accessible, and understandable by a person who had spent a semester learning what each one was for. A tune-up on one of those cars meant pulling the distributor cap, cleaning or replacing the points and condenser, gapping and installing new spark plugs in each cylinder, adjusting the ignition timing with a timing light, and tuning the carburetor mixture screw until the engine idled clean. You could do every step of that job with hand tools that fit in a moderate-sized case, and when the engine ran correctly afterward, you had done it. The Pontiac GTO, introduced for the 1964 model year by dropping a 389 cubic inch V8 from a full-size car into the lighter Tempest body, started the muscle car era and lit a competition among Detroit's Big Three that ran for most of the decade. Ford answered with the Mustang the same year. Chevrolet brought the Camaro in 1967. Dodge produced the Charger. These cars were everywhere in the late 1960s, bought by men in their 20s and 30s who timed their oil changes by the odometer and regarded a basic tune-up as something they could perform on a Saturday morning. The auto shop teacher understood what was on the roads and taught toward it. High-compression V8 engines with 4-barrel carburetors, mechanical ignition systems built around a spinning distributor, drum brakes on most models, and the newer disc brakes appearing on the front axles of performance cars. These were the systems the class addressed, and they were the same systems your uncle worked on in his driveway and your neighbor argued about in the parking lot. For black families in the 1960s, the automobile was not a convenience, it was infrastructure. In cities where public transit was inadequate in black neighborhoods, and in rural areas where distances between towns were measured in miles of road without a service station, a car that ran was not optional, and a car that broke down in the wrong place at the wrong time was not just inconvenient. The ability to maintain a car, to diagnose a misfiring engine, or a failing brake cylinder, or a cooling system that was dropping temperature faster than it should, was economic knowledge in the most immediate sense. A black mechanic who could diagnose and fix what was wrong with the car was saving money on labor rates at shops that might not serve black customers with equal care or equal pricing. What the auto shop classroom provided, when it was accessible and well taught, was a layer of economic self-sufficiency that extended far past school hours. The tracking problem complicated this, as it complicated every shop class. Black students were channeled into the vocational track at rates that reflected race and income more than aptitude, and once in the track, they were in the room that the college counselors had already written off as the destination for students who were not going further. A black boy in auto shop had sometimes been placed there by a guidance system that had decided his future without asking him about it. That placement was not neutral, even when the skills were real and the teacher was excellent. The room held two truths at once, and the students inside it carried both. The 1973 oil crisis, when Arab oil-producing nations imposed an embargo that sent gasoline prices sharply upward and created lines at filling stations across the country, changed the car that Americans drove. The V8 muscle cars lost their market to smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles, and the engines that followed were incrementally more complex. Electronic ignition systems began replacing points-type distributors in the mid-1970s. Fuel injection started replacing carburetors in the 1980s. By 1996, the federal government required that all new cars carry standardized onboard diagnostic systems, known as OBD2, which recorded fault codes that a diagnostic scan tool could read out. The era of seeing everything under an open hood and knowing what it was and what it was doing was over. Modern engines required not just mechanical knowledge, but the ability to read computer output and interpret sensor data, skills that demanded a different kind of training than the auto shop classroom had been built to provide. Schools that had invested in the equipment and bays for 1960s-era mechanical work found themselves holding infrastructure suited to cars that were increasingly rare on the road and increasingly hard to source for classroom use. Auto shop disappeared the same way the other shop classes disappeared, through the converging pressure of college prep tracking, liability concerns, funding cuts, and the No Child Left Behind testing regime that measured nothing the class produced. By the early 2000s, 90% of automotive shop programs had been cut from the Los Angeles Unified School District. Students who had grown up watching their fathers diagnose a rough idle by listening to the engine and adjusting the carburetor by feel stopped seeing that knowledge modeled anywhere outside their own households. The gap between a person who understood a car mechanically and a person who was afraid of everything under the hood widened with each graduating class that had never spent a period in a bay with a hood open and a teacher who knew what each part was called and why it mattered. You learned in that room that a car was not mysterious. It ran on specific principles, obeyed specific rules, and failed in specific, diagnosable ways. Nobody had to explain why that knowledge mattered. The car in your driveway explained it every time you needed it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 10 down. Every one of those rooms put knowledge in your hands or on the page. The next one put it in your mouth and made you stand up in front of the class and use your voice as a trained instrument. That one is coming up next. Section 11. Elocution. Breath control came first. Before the opening word of the memorized piece, before the eyes came up to meet the audience, before the posture the teacher had spent 3 weeks correcting into something close to right, you had to know where the air was coming from, not the upper chest, which produced thin sound that degraded under stress, the diaphragm, the muscle below the lungs that, when activated correctly, pushed a column of air upward through the chest and throat and out into a room with enough force to reach the back wall, without the voice sounding strained to do it. The teacher would sometimes press her hand flat against your abdomen and ask you to push against it when you inhaled. If the hand moved, you were breathing correctly. If the chest rose instead, she made you try again. This, before a single word of the actual piece had been delivered. Elocution was a separate course, and in schools that did not offer it as its own subject, it lived inside a public speaking or oral English class that had the same structure and the same demands. The subject was the deliberate, trained control of the voice as an instrument of communication. Projection, pace, pause, emphasis, pronunciation, and gesture. Each one a skill with its own set of correct and incorrect approaches that could be learned through practice, the same way a piano scale could be learned. The textbooks used in the early 20th century, collections of speeches and poems, specifically chosen for their suitability as performance material, were still in use in various forms through the 1960s. You were not simply reading aloud, you were delivering. The distinction was the whole course. Declamation was one of the central exercises. You chose a speech by a historical figure or a public figure of some standing, memorized a portion of it completely, and delivered it from memory to the class as though the words were your own and the occasion was real. The material needed to have been publicly delivered, and the words could not be changed. What changed was the interpretation, the decisions you made about where to slow down, where to let a word carry its full weight before moving to the next one, where a pause of 2 seconds before a significant phrase would cause the listener to lean slightly forward in anticipation. The teacher graded on whether those decisions were made at all, not just whether you had remembered the words. Getting through it without error was a floor, not a ceiling. The ceiling was making the room feel what the words were designed to make someone feel. Oral interpretation pushed in a related direction but asked something different. Where declamation took a speech already designed for performance and asked you to perform it, oral interpretation took a poem or a prose passage and asked you to transform it from the page into sound. A poem read silently and a poem performed aloud are two different experiences, and the elocution class understood this in the most practical terms. You studied how the stress pattern of a line determined what emotion it carried. You studied how a short sentence after several long ones hit the ear, the way a period hit the eye on a page, with finality. You studied how the consonants at the end of a word, the hard stops, the sibilant sounds, the soft nasals, each produced different sensations in a listening ear, and therefore needed to be managed rather than left to chance. The teacher moved around the room while students performed, listening from different positions in the space to assess whether the projection was holding all the way to the far corner. For Black students in the 1960s, the elocution classroom was one of the few school spaces where what happened inside the walls had a direct and visible counterpart in the world outside. The civil rights movement was being carried forward on voice. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. understood the pause the same way the elocution teacher taught it. Fannie Lou Hamer, testifying before the Credentials Committee at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, used repetition the way the declamation exercises taught repetition, returning to a phrase with increasing intensity until the weight of it became impossible to ignore. John Lewis, delivering his address at the March on Washington in August 1963, made decisions about which words to land on and which to move through quickly that were identical in their mechanics to the decisions the public speaking teacher was asking students to make about a memorized passage. The skills the classroom was teaching were being used in real time, on national television, by people who looked like the students in the chairs. The Black church had understood this long before any school curriculum caught up with it. Frederick Douglass, who became one of the most celebrated orators of the 19th century, described learning to speak through the ministers he heard in Black churches in Baltimore and through the enslaved storytellers whose performances he absorbed as a child. He taught himself the formal structures of rhetoric, partly through a textbook called The Columbian Orator, purchased secondhand as a boy. That combination, the church tradition and the formal textbook, the performed oral tradition and the structured study of how voice worked on an audience, produced a school of black oratory that operated at a level the elocution class was trying to approach from the other direction. Hall Lawrence Dunbar's poems had been memorized and performed in African Methodist Episcopal churches and community gatherings since the turn of the century, passed person to person and generation to generation as living material, not as printed text behind glass. When a black student stood at the front of a 1960s public speaking class to deliver a memorized piece to 20 seated classmates, they were walking into a tradition their community had been practicing and refining since long before the course had a name. Gesture was the part of the curriculum that felt most foreign to a modern sensibility and most essential to the teachers who ran the class. The position of the hands while speaking was not ornamental. It was communicative. An open palm turned upward toward the audience carried a specific meaning, an offering, an appeal. A hand held flat and moved to the side punctuated a separation between ideas. A single finger pointed downward emphasized a specific claim. These were codified positions, not improvised, and you practiced them the same way you practiced the breathing exercises, standing in front of a mirror or in front of the class, executing the gesture at the moment the text called for it, and holding it long enough for the audience to register it before releasing it. The teacher would sometimes stop a student mid-performance to demonstrate the difference between a gesture executed correctly and the same gesture executed a half-second too late, and the difference was audible even when it was only visible, because timing in performance existed in the body the same way it existed in music. Elocution began losing its footing in the 1960s for the same reason many formal academic subjects lost ground during that decade, the argument that artifice was a form of dishonesty and that natural communication was more authentic than trained communication. The anti-curriculum movement prized spontaneity and personal expression and viewed the formal study of gesture and emphasis as a kind of cultural policing that marked certain ways of speaking as correct and others as deficient. The class did make those distinctions, which was part of what made it powerful and part of what made it vulnerable. By the 1980s, speech classes in most schools had shifted toward oral communication skills in a group context, discussion and presentation and basic delivery, rather than the memorization and formal performance that elocution had centered. The solo recitation, the memorized piece delivered with trained breath and deliberate pause and studied gesture to a room of students, was largely gone. What the course had built, when it was taken seriously and taught well, was an understanding that language in the air operated by different rules than language on a page. A sentence that moved correctly from one ear to a room of ears arrived with an authority that the same sentence printed on a line could not match. Nobody who sat through a real performance of a real piece, delivered by someone who had put in the practice time, could miss that distinction. The room changed when the voice was in command of itself. You learned to feel the change from the front of the room, looking at the faces of the people in the chairs. 11 subjects. Every one of them occupied a specific room with a specific smell and a specific set of rules. The next one also had a specific room, and the smell was different from all the others, and the rule was precision. A line 1/16 of an inch was not the same as a line 1/8 of an inch, and the difference was visible to anyone trained to see it. That one is coming up next. Section 12. Drafting T-square against the left edge of the board, slid upward along the channel to where the horizontal needed to be, held steady while the pencil moved right across the paper from one measured point to another. That was the first thing the teacher showed you and the last thing you were still practicing at the end of the year, because the T-square either stayed exactly parallel to the top and bottom edges of the board, or it drifted, and a drifted line produced a drawing that was wrong from that point forward in ways that only became visible later, when the pieces that were supposed to connect did not connect. Drafting operated on a principle of accumulated consequence. An error of 1/16 of an inch at the beginning of a drawing might produce an error of a 1/4 inch by the time the drawing was finished, and the drawing either worked or it did not. There was no partial credit for a floor plan whose interior walls failed to meet the exterior. Drafting class existed inside the industrial arts sequence, alongside wood shop and metal shop, but the room was different from either. No sawdust, no engine smell, no machine running at speed. The drafting room was quiet in a particular way, the quiet of concentrated individual attention. Every student at a separate inclined board, with a T-square, and a set of triangles, and a compass, and a scale ruler, and a mechanical pencil sharpened to a point fine enough to produce a line width the teacher could judge at arm's length. The boards were mounted at an angle, about 15 degrees, so your wrist sat naturally against the surface, and the line of sight was direct to the paper. The room's quiet had the texture of a room where everyone was counting simultaneously, where the margin for error was small enough that nobody was willing to interrupt their own focus by speaking. The tools were specific, and the purpose of each was exact. The T-square produced horizontal lines by running along the board's left edge. The 30-60-90 triangle, placed against the T-square, produced lines at 30, 60, and 90 degrees to the horizontal. The 45-45-90 triangle produced 45-degree lines. The compass produced circles and arcs to a radius you set by measuring against the scale and locking the instrument with a small adjustment screw before you drew. The French curve, a template of irregular curves in a standard shape, allowed you to draw smooth, non-circular curves through a series of points you had already plotted by calculation. The scale ruler was not used for drawing lines, but for measuring them, graduated in several different ratios that allowed you to represent a full-size object at 1/8 scale, or 1/4 scale, or architectural scale, each ratio printed along a separate edge of the ruler. You chose the scale for the drawing before you began and maintained it throughout, because a single object drawn at two different scales within the same view was not a drawing. It was a mistake with a line around it. Orthographic projection was the central concept of the course, and the one that required the most actual thinking to learn. An object in 3 dimensions had to be represented in 2 dimensions on a flat sheet, and the convention for doing this involved drawing the same object from 3 separate viewpoints and arranging those views in a standard pattern on the page. The front view occupied the center left. The top view sat directly above it, aligned along the same vertical axis. The right side view sat to the right of the front view, aligned along the same vertical axis. Any feature visible in the front view, but not in the top view, would appear in the front view as a solid line, and in the top view as a dashed hidden line, because the convention required that hidden features be shown rather than omitted, so that the person reading the drawing could understand the complete shape of the object from the drawing alone without having to make assumptions. You could read a drawing that followed the convention. You could not read one that did not. Lettering was its own subject inside the larger subject. Engineers used a specific alphabet called vertical uppercase Gothic for the notes and dimensions that appeared on technical drawings, a style with no serifs and consistent stroke widths. Each character formed the same way every time. The teacher showed you the sequence of strokes required to form each letter correctly. The H built in a specific order, the A with its crossbar drawn last, the G with its horizontal bar ending exactly at the center of the letter. You practiced the alphabet on graph paper before you applied it to a real drawing, because lettering on a finished drawing that was illegible or inconsistent discredited the drawing regardless of how accurate the line work was. A drawing was a document. Its authority came from its precision, and that precision extended to every mark on the page, including the marks that spelled words. The blueprint was the finished product, or more precisely, the reproduction of the finished product. Original drawings were done in pencil on vellum, a translucent paper, and then run through a process that produced a blue copy with white lines. Senior drafter Walter Siridan, who began his career in the late 1960s, described the experience of running blueprints. You took the exposed paper and used ammonia to turn the lines blue. The smell of that chemical process was the smell of something being made permanent. The pencil drawing on vellum transformed into a document someone could build from. An architect or an engineer or a contractor could take a blueprint rolled in a tube to a construction site and read it in the field, using it the way you might use a map, to understand how the finished thing was supposed to be assembled from its parts. The career the class was preparing students for was real and broadly available in the 1960s. Every manufacturing company needed draftsmen who could produce accurate technical drawings of parts, assemblies, and facilities. Every architecture firm needed people who could translate a designer's sketch into a set of construction documents. Every engineering office needed staff who could take a calculation and render its result as a drawing that a builder could follow. Mechanical drawing was listed in the 1962 curriculum at Central High School in Pennington, New Jersey, alongside woodshop and metal shop as a standard industrial arts offering, and the same was true in school districts across the country. The class was pointed at a workforce that needed this specific skill, and the workforce was large and accessible enough that a student who completed 2 or 3 years of drafting and showed aptitude could find employment in a drafting room directly after graduation. Even Sutherland published a doctoral thesis at MIT in 1963, describing a system called Sketchpad that allowed a user to interact with a computer display using a light pen to create and manipulate geometric figures. That thesis became the foundation of computer graphics as a field, and the trajectory it established ran directly toward what the industry would eventually call CAD, computer-aided design. By the early 1960s, General Motors and other large manufacturers had begun internal research into computer-based drafting systems. Those systems ran on mainframe computers the size of rooms. available only to corporations with the capital to acquire them, and they remained in that category for 2 decades. In December 1982, Autodesk released AutoCAD version 1.0 at the Comdex trade show in Las Vegas, introducing the first computer-aided design program built to run on a personal computer. The software produced lines, arcs, circles, and text on screen using commands typed at a keyboard, and it could drive a plotter that reproduced the drawing on paper. A professional draftsman who had spent a decade learning to control the weight of a pencil line against a T-square could now produce the same line in AutoCAD in a fraction of the time and correct it without an eraser. By the mid-1990s, AutoCAD had become the industry standard, and the drafting room with its inclined boards and mechanical pencils and quiet concentration had largely been replaced by rows of monitors. The high school drafting class, which had been producing graduates who could enter that room, found the room had changed into something the class was no longer equipped to teach. Nobody had to announce that the course was ending. The jobs it was preparing students for changed faster than the curriculum could follow, and the class simply became harder to justify. What stayed was the underlying reasoning, the understanding that a 3-dimensional object could be fully described on a flat surface if you knew which views to draw and which convention to follow. That reasoning moved into computer science and into architecture and into engineering, and nobody called it drafting anymore. But it came from the same place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 12 subjects down. Every one of them prepared you for something specific in the world outside the school building. The next one prepared you for something the world hoped would never happen. It came straight out of the Cold War, and it used the school day to teach you what to do if a bomb fell on your city. That one is next. Section 13. Civil defense under the desk. Knees on the floor, hands laced behind your neck. That was the position. The teacher said the word and you went there, faster than you had gone to it the week before, because the drills were timed and the time had been getting shorter, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was live on the television at home, and everyone in the room was old enough to understand that the desk was not going to save them if the thing they were practicing for actually happened. You crouched on the linoleum tile and stared at the steel leg of the chair in front of you, and waited for the all-clear signal that meant you could come back up and return to the lesson. In October 1962, a teacher in Springfield, Missouri, timed her 2nd and 3rd grade students completing the drill, from standing position to fully covered under desks in 1.8 seconds. A photographer in the room was afraid he had missed his shot. The children were very good at this by then. Civil defense education did not begin in the classroom by accident. Congress created the Federal Civil Defense Administration in 1950, the year after the Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear device at a remote test site in Kazakhstan. And from the beginning, the FCDA understood that the most efficient way to reach most of the country was through the schools. Schools already had every family's children for 6 hours a day. Schools had authority structures in place for directing large numbers of people simultaneously. Schools could run drills and track compliance, and build the muscle memory of a response into a population that would carry that response into adulthood. The FCDA produced a film called Duck and Cover in 1951, directed by Anthony Rizzo of Archer Productions, with school children from New York City and Astoria, New York. The film debuted in classrooms on March 6, 1952, and by the following years had been screened for millions of students across the country. Its central character was an animated turtle named Bert, who wore a helmet and demonstrated the correct response to a nuclear flash by pulling immediately into his shell. You were the turtle. The desk was the shell. What the film asked children to believe was that the first indicator of a nuclear detonation would be a bright flash of light, and that in the approximately 1 second between that flash and the arrival of the blast wave, a child could duck under a desk or against a wall and survive what followed with manageable injuries. In terms of blast physics and the weapons available in 1951, this was not entirely without basis. An atomic bomb of the type used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, detonating at a sufficient distance, produced a wave of pressure and a spray of debris and glass that a covered child might survive. The film was not built on nothing. What it was built on became insufficient almost immediately. In 1954, the United States tested Castle Bravo at Bikini Atoll, a thermonuclear device producing a yield that dwarfed anything the duck and cover posture was designed for. In 1961, the Soviet Union tested the Tsar Bomba, a 58-megaton weapon carrying more explosive force than every device detonated in World War II combined. By the early 1960s, the drill that children were still performing in classrooms across the country had been designed for a category of weapon that no longer represented the actual threat. Nobody in any position of authority said this to the children. The high school civil defense curriculum went further than the drills. The Quora testimony of someone who attended school in the late 1960s describes a dedicated unit inside health class, developed from Federal Civil Defense Administration materials, that covered post-nuclear war survival in specific terms. How to treat radiation burns and radiation poisoning, how to manage compound fractures in the absence of professional medical care, what to eat and what not to eat in the aftermath of fallout. The Office of Civil Defense published a student manual titled Personal and Family Survival as a Civil Defense Adult Education course, and versions of this material moved into school curricula as the decade wore on. The class was trying to equip you with practical knowledge for a scenario that the government's own materials acknowledged would kill the majority of people in affected areas. What remained in the lesson was the portion of information useful to survivors. The lesson assumed you would be one. That assumption was not evenly distributed. The Federal Civil Defense Administration's survival literature was written primarily for a suburban audience. This was not incidental. The planning assumption built into civil defense doctrine was that major cities would be primary targets for Soviet nuclear weapons, which was militarily correct, and that most people in those cities would not survive, which was also correct. What the doctrine did not spell out but implied through its audience was that preparation was designed for people living at sufficient distance from target cities to have a chance. The black population of America in the 1960s was concentrated in exactly the urban centers that civil defense planners had written off: Harlem, Bronx, South Side of Chicago, North Philadelphia, Central Los Angeles. The survival literature about which foods to store, which rooms of your house to reinforce, which door to seal first when the sirens sounded, was addressed to homeowners in the suburbs, with basements and storage space, and the capital to stock them. A family in a Bronx apartment building or a shotgun house in Birmingham was receiving a curriculum about survival from a government that had not accounted for their survival in the underlying plan. The private fallout shelter was the most visible symbol of this gap. Throughout the early 1960s, families who could afford it were encouraged to build shelters in their basements, stocked with 2 weeks of canned food, a battery-powered radio, and basic medical supplies. The cost was real, and the construction required space that most urban and lower-income families did not have. A study of who actually built private shelters in that era would not have found them evenly distributed across race and income. The public shelter system, which relied on designating basements in existing buildings and marking them with yellow and black signs, was the official answer to this problem. Those signs appeared on the sides of school buildings and post offices and church basements across the country. And they were not in neighborhoods based on safety calculations. They were in neighborhoods based on available structures. In October 1962, when the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis made nuclear war feel not like a rehearsed possibility, but a scheduled appointment, the question of where you would actually go if the sirens sounded was not a theoretical question for any family in any American city. The answer was different depending on where you lived. Inside the classroom, the civil defense lesson asked you to practice a response without ever naming the gap between the practice and the protection it provided. Every child old enough to reason understood that the desk was not shelter. Rick Ginsburg, who later became dean of the University of Kansas School of Education, would say in retrospect that every kid in America knew this was ridiculous and that it was arguably the stupidest thing ever done in American education. That assessment is harsh but sits on solid ground. The value of the drill was not physical, it was psychological. It gave a population in the presence of an unmanageable threat a manageable action to perform, a routine to follow, a gesture toward control in a situation where no actual control was available. Whether that was a reasonable exchange, whether the terror the drills produced outweighed the comfort they offered, was debated then and has been debated since. By the 1980s, most schools had ended the drills. The weapons had grown too large for the posture to sustain even the pretense of protection, and the culture had moved toward confronting the nuclear question directly rather than crouching in front of it. The FCDA's emergency preparedness mandate was absorbed into FEMA, which redirected its focus toward natural disasters, events survivable enough that preparation made a genuine difference. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the specific anxiety that had filled school basements with yellow and black signs dissolved with it, and the shelf in the supply room where the civil defense materials had lived was cleared to make room for something else. The drills simply stopped, the way a habit stops when the thing driving it is gone, and the generation that had performed them moved on, and mostly did not talk about what it had felt like to be a child practicing for the end of the world on a Tuesday morning. Nobody had to explain to you what was at stake. The drill explained it every time. Another subject from the same era asked nothing of your body and nothing of your fear. It asked only that you sit still and listen, and that you hear something in the music that you had not known was there before the teacher named it. That one is coming up next. Section 14, Music Appreciation Record. On the turntable, needle lowered into the groove, and the room changed. What came out of the speaker at the front of the classroom was not background sound. It was the assignment. You were supposed to listen the way you were supposed to read, with attention trained on something specific, a theme introduced in the first movement returning in the third, a cello line moving below the violins and carrying the harmonic weight, while the upper strings moved over it, a kettle drum entering at a moment the teacher had already pointed to on the board as significant. Listening was the skill the class was teaching, and the class understood listening as something that could be learned and improved, rather than something you either had or did not. That understanding was the whole argument for the course. Music appreciation had been working its way into American schools since the early 20th century, carried first by the phonograph and then by the radio. Walter Damrosch, who had conducted the New York Symphony and served as a musical advisor to NBC from 1927 forward, ran a program called the Music Appreciation Hour on the NBC radio network every Friday from 1928 to 1942, broadcast in 4 series aimed at 4 different age groups, with teacher instruction manuals and student notebooks prepared for each series. Schools across the country used the program in their classrooms, setting up a radio and gathering students to listen, while Damrosch explained what was happening in the music before it played and what to listen for while it did. The program ended in 1942 when Damrosch refused to accept NBC's request to cut the hour-long broadcast to half an hour, which is the kind of stand that reveals what a person thinks actually matters. By the time the music appreciation class was running in your 1960s high school building, that radio tradition had moved into the dedicated classroom with a record player and a collection of LP albums. The long-playing record, running at 33 1/3 revolutions per minute and introduced commercially in 1948, had made it possible to fit an entire symphonic movement on a single side of a 12-inch disc without the interruptions that the older 78 RPM records required. By the 1960s, a school music library might hold recordings of full symphonies, concertos, operas, and chamber works, each one playable in a single session, without the teacher having to stop to flip a record in the middle of a development section. The sound that came out of the classroom speaker was richer than anything a radio had delivered, with a full dynamic range from the quiet passages where a solo violin moved above a sustained chord, to the sections where a full orchestra was running at capacity, and the speaker produced something you felt in the chest, rather than heard with the ear. The curriculum covered the major periods and their identifying characteristics. Baroque music, the period from roughly 1600 to 1750, with its ornamentation and counterpoint, and the specific sound of a harpsichord rather than a piano. The classical period that followed it, which valued clarity and balance and proportion, the elegant structures of the sonata and the symphony with their defined sections of exposition and development and recapitulation. The Romantic period from the 19th century, which expanded those structures and filled them with a different emotional temperature. Longer melodic lines, louder dynamics, larger orchestras, and composers whose personal lives the teacher described in enough detail to make the music feel like autobiography. You listened to the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and the teacher explained what a motif was and what it meant for a composer to build an entire movement from 4 notes. You listened to a Vivaldi concerto and learned what a ritornello was, the recurring orchestral passage that anchored the solo instrument's flights of elaboration. You identified the instruments by their timbre, the warmth of a cello in its upper register, the brightness of an oboe, the particular weight of a French horn sustaining a chord underneath a melody carried by the strings. Aaron Copland's book What to Listen For in Music, first published in 1939 and revised in 1957, was used in some music appreciation courses and stated the central premise of the class plainly: you could not develop a better appreciation of music merely by reading about it, and nothing could take the place of actually listening. The class was designed for students who would never perform music at a professional level and might never read a note of written music in their lives. It was asking them to become better listeners, which was asking them to be more fully present in the presence of music, which the teacher understood as both an aesthetic skill and a human one. For Black students in those classrooms, the record player presented a particular kind of silence. The music appreciation curriculum was built entirely on Western European art music, the centuries of development that ran from the medieval church through the Renaissance and Baroque and classical and Romantic periods to the early 20th century. What it did not include was jazz. It did not include blues. It did not include gospel or spirituals or the music of the black church that many students had been hearing every Sunday morning for their entire lives. Duke Ellington was not on the shelf in the music library. Louis Armstrong was not there. Ella Fitzgerald was not there. The music that had emerged from black American life over the preceding century, the music that by the 1960s was the dominant influence on popular music worldwide, was invisible inside the room that was supposed to teach the appreciation of music. The phonograph that played Beethoven on Friday afternoon was the same technology that Motown Records, founded in Detroit in 1959, was using to distribute the music of the Supremes and Marvin Gaye and Smokey Robinson to every household in the country. The music appreciation class and Motown were happening simultaneously in American culture, with the class proceeding as though only one of them existed. This was not incidental. The curriculum's definition of music worth appreciating was a definition built around European tradition and its institutional authority. Jazz, which had been developing its own forms of structural complexity and harmonic sophistication for decades, was categorized as popular entertainment rather than music that required or rewarded the kind of attention the class was training. The argument for excluding it was that jazz was not written music, not part of the classical tradition, not subject to the kind of formal analysis the curriculum was built around. The argument against that position was sitting in the chairs every day, carrying a musical knowledge the class had no vocabulary for. The subject was one of the first to go when school budgets tightened through the 1970s and 1980s. Music appreciation was a listening course, with no performance component, no ensemble, no instrument rental fees collected, no concert for parents at the end of the semester. It produced nothing visible. When principals were evaluating which courses to cut to meet budget targets, a class where students sat in a room and listened to records was easier to eliminate than band, which at least had a marching season, or choir, which performed at graduation. By the time No Child Left Behind mandated accountability in math and reading, the music appreciation class had already been gone from most school schedules for a decade or more, replaced by nothing that asks students to practice directed listening, or by a single combined music elective that compressed what had been a full year of active listening into one semester of general music survey. What the class had actually done, when the record was playing and the teacher was pointing to the board and naming what was happening in the music, was teach you that listening was an active verb, that what you heard changed depending on what you were trying to hear, that the difference between having music in the background and actually being inside it was the difference between having the lights on and seeing. The teacher lowered the needle, and the room changed, and for the length of the side of the record you were inside something someone else had built, and the teacher's job was to give you the blueprint. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 14 subjects down, and every one of them already existed before you arrived in the room. The last one was different. Students built it themselves, fought for it, demanded it from institutions that had spent centuries leaving it out. It was the one class that taught your own history. That one is next. Section 15, Black Studies. Every other subject on this list had a room before it had students. Penmanship had its practice sheets. Typing had its rows of machines. Geography had its wall map rolled up above the chalkboard, waiting. Black Studies worked the other way around. The students came first. They arrived at schools that had been built without the subject, sat through years of curricula that organized the world without organizing them inside it, and then at some point, they stopped sitting quietly and asked for the room. That is the essential fact that separates this subject from the 14 that preceded it on this list. Nobody handed it to you. You fought for it, and then you walked in. Carter G. Woodson understood before anyone else why the room was necessary. Born in 1875 in New Canton, Virginia, the son of formerly enslaved parents, he earned a doctorate from Harvard University in 1912, the second Black American in history to do so. In 1915, he founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in Chicago, and in 1916, he began publishing the Journal of Negro History. He launched Negro History Week in February 1926, choosing that month deliberately to coincide with the birthdays of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. His explanation of what he was doing was precise and unsentimentally stated. A nation that erases the history of millions of its citizens cannot fully understand itself, and more specifically, a people that is taught nothing of its own history will be easier to suppress. He said it plainly, that there would be no lynching if it did not start in the schoolroom, meaning that the violence done to Black lives in the streets was prepared for in classrooms that presented Black people as absent from history or present only as problems. His goal was not a week of celebration. His hope was that the week would become unnecessary, absorbed into a curriculum that no longer required a special occasion to include Black people in its account of the world. That absorption never happened in the way Woodson hoped. But inside all black schools through the era of legal segregation, something real had been built. Black teachers in all black schools had been teaching black history for decades, not always because the official curriculum required it, but because those teachers understood what their students needed to know about themselves and passed that knowledge through whatever channel the official structure allowed. Negro History Week became a cultural norm in black schools by the end of the 1930s through the grassroots organizing of those teachers who gathered study materials, produced performances, formed history clubs, and treated the second week of February as a serious intellectual event rather than a ceremonial decoration. Those schools produced graduates who carried that knowledge forward, who understood that their history was long and complicated and serious, who had been taught by teachers who believed their education was the central project of their professional lives. Desegregation disrupted this without fully replacing it. As black students entered previously white schools through the 1950s and into the 1960s, many of the black teachers who had built that tradition lost their jobs. Districts that were absorbing black students were not proportionally absorbing black teachers. The expertise that had lived in those all-black schools, the teachers who knew the history and knew how to convey it, and believed that conveying it was urgent, moved to the margin, or out of the profession entirely. By 1968, only 18.4% of black students in the South attended desegregated schools. But the ones who did encountered classrooms where their history was not invisible, through malice in most cases, but through a curriculum that had been built without them and had never been revised to include them. You could graduate from an American high school in 1965 having studied American history for 4 years and understood very little about the specific experience of the people who made up the largest non-European population the country had ever held. The strike at San Francisco State College began on November 6, 1968, led by the Black Students Union and a coalition called the Third World Liberation Front. It lasted 134 days, the longest student strike in the history of American higher education. Students walked into classrooms and announced that the strike was on. They listed their demands, which centered on the establishment of a Black Studies department with black faculty, curriculum developed by and for black students, and control over who was hired to teach it. The administration resisted. 731 students were arrested over the course of the strike and faced trial. The faculty who supported the strike were warned they would be fired if they continued. The standoff held through the fall semester and into the spring of 1969. The strike ended on March 20, 1969, with an agreement that established the College of Ethnic Studies, the first of its kind in the country, which included a Black Studies department as one of its founding units. Nathan Hare, who had been designated to chair the department, was not rehired the following year. Neither was George Murray, the English instructor who had been one of the strike's most visible voices. The students had won the room and immediately began losing the teachers they had fought for. When the curriculum worked, it was serious. The 1968 Black Studies program at San Francisco State included courses with specific content: sociology of black oppression, modern African thought and literature, recurrent themes in 20th century African American thought, avant-garde jazz, and black improvisation, among others. These were not simplified survey courses. They were attempts to build a curriculum that treated black intellectual and cultural life with the same rigor that the rest of the university applied to European intellectual and cultural life. The students who designed them understood that the absence they were correcting was not incidental. It was the result of decisions made at every level of American education over many decades. Decisions about whose knowledge counted, whose history was worth preserving in a course catalog, whose literature was worth analyzing with the tools the university offered its students. At the K-12 level, the subject had a harder time. By the early 1970s, more than 500 programs and departments in higher education had been established in response to student pressure, and secondary schools across the country moved to create Black history courses in response to similar pressure from students and parents. What followed was not always what those students and parents had asked for. Historian Jonathan Zimmerman, writing later about what happened to Black studies in public schools, described classes that fizzled quickly because students found them boring, because schools struggled to locate qualified teachers for subjects that had not been part of any pre-service training program, because course materials were hastily prepared to meet sudden demand. The classes often devolved, as he put it, into a litany of heroes and holidays, dutifully repeated each year. Black students noticed the reduction. Among them circulated a joke about Crispus Attucks, the black man widely regarded as the first person to die in the American Revolution, who seemed to die every semester in these classes and then vanish from the curriculum along with everyone else who might have complicated the story. The subject that had been demanded with 134 days of sacrifice became, in many schools, a month of posters. The deeper failure was structural. Schools that introduced Black Studies courses were often simultaneously using those courses as an excuse to leave the regular curriculum unchanged. If a parent or a student complained that Black history was absent from the general American history class, the administration could point to the Black Studies elective and say the subject had been covered. The segregation of the knowledge was the point. Black history in a dedicated room, offered to students who chose it, was different from Black history as a necessary part of every American's understanding of the country they lived in. Woodson had understood this distinction in 1926. It had not been resolved by 1975, and it has not been resolved since. 14 subjects in this list existed because someone decided they were worth teaching and built a room for them. The room was there when you arrived, and you moved through it according to its rules, and when you left, you carried what it had given you. Black Studies was different in kind. It was built from the outside in, against resistance, by people your age or not much older, who had decided that the absence was intolerable, and that they were the ones who would have to say so. The room they built was imperfect and underfunded, and staffed inadequately, and allowed to drift toward the superficial, and then quietly emptied out and repurposed. But the demand that produced it was not imperfect. It was precise. It said, "We have been in every room on this list, and our history has been in none of them, and that is not an accident, and it is not acceptable." That was simply the argument. It was never answered. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.